So I'll invite Arpit Chaturvedi. Arpit is heading GPODs and GPI, which are also our knowledge partners in this grand mega conference on terrorism. Arpit, over to you.
Thank you so much, Abhinav. And I really enjoyed the discussion by Mr. Cameron and Ms. Salma. And I welcome you all to our discussion on the last day on terrorism and counter-terrorism challenges and the way forward. My name is Arpit Chaturvedi, and I'm the Chief Executive Officer of Global Policy Insights and a fellow at the Usanas Foundation. And today we are going to be talking about this really important issue on terrorism, counter-terrorism, and challenges and way forward. And what we're going to do is that I'm going to invite all of our speakers. We have 3 distinguished guests right now. I'm going to introduce them, and I'm going to invite them to deliver an opening address of around 15 minutes, where they can give us an overview of what, in their opinion, are the current challenges and the challenges that we'll have to deal with going ahead in the future on issues of terrorism and counterterrorism. So, Abhinav, if we have all of the speakers in the room, do you think I should go ahead and introduce them right now?
Yeah, please go ahead. Please go ahead.
Perfect.
We can begin with Dr. Gupta. Yeah.
Thank you. All right. So our first speaker for the day is Dr. Arvind Gupta. Dr. Gupta served in the Indian Foreign Services. He's retired in 1979, and he served as the former Deputy National Security Advisor and Secretary in the National Security Council Secretariat from 2014 to 17. He also served as the Joint Secretary NSCS on deputation from Ministry of External Affairs from 1999 to 2007. He dealt with a wide range of national security issues within the NSC structures. He also had wide-ranging interaction in official capacity with delegations in other countries. He is a former Director General, Institute of Defense Studies and Analysis, IDSA. He also, from 2008 to 11, served in IDSA as the Lal Bahadur Shastri Chair for National Security. He has conducted track 2 level interactions with think tanks of other countries, the Ministry of Defense. He also served in the Indian diplomatic missions in Moscow, London, and Ankara. He dealt with Afghanistan, Kashmir, the Soviet Union, Russia, Central Asia in the Ministry of External Affairs. He holds an MSc in Physics from Delhi University. He's been a visiting member of the Tata Institute of Fundamental Research, an MPhil, and PhD from the School of International Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University. His interest areas include problems of national and international security, foreign policy, issues of defense strategy, ancient Indian thought, nation building, science and technology, and others. He has written 4 books and co-edited several. Dr. Gupta, thank you so much for joining us today, and indeed a pleasure speaking to you.
Thank you.
Our next panelist is Mr. Matthew Warren. Dr. Warren is the director of the RMIT University Center for Cybersecurity Research and Innovation, and a professor of cybersecurity at RMIT University, Australia. He has held roles such as Deputy Director of University Research, Head of School, Deputy Head of School Program Leader for several programs during his tenure at the Deakin University. He's a researcher in the areas of cybersecurity, computer ethics, and has received numerous grants and awards from national and international funding bodies such as the Australian Research Council, Engineering, Physics, Science Research Council in the United Kingdom, National Research Foundation in South Africa. Dr. Warren has taught in Australia, Finland, Hong Kong, and the United Kingdom. Dr. Warren, indeed looking forward to our discussion today, and so good to have you here with us.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here.
Thank you. And last but certainly not the least, we have Dr. Anne Speckard. Dr. Speckard is the Director of International Center for Study of Violent Extremism and serves as an Adjunct Associate Professor of Psychiatry at Georgetown University School of Medicine. She has interviewed over 700 terrorists, their family members, and supporters in various parts of the world, including in Western Europe, the Balkans, Central Asia, and former Soviet Union and the Middle East. In the past 5 years, she has in-depth psychologically interviewed over 250 ISIS defectors, returnees, and prisoners, as well as 16 Al Shabaab cadres. She's also interviewed their family members as well as other ideologues, studying their trajectories into and out of terrorism, their experience inside ISIS and Al Shabaab, as well as developing breaking the ISIS brand counter narrative program materials from the interviews, which include over 250 short counter narrative videos of terrorists denouncing their groups as un Islamic, corrupt, and brutal. Which have been used in over 150 Facebook and Instagram campaigns globally. Since 2020, she has launched the ICSVE, Escape Hate Counter Narrative Project, interviewing 25 white supremacists and members of hate groups, developing counter narratives from their interviews as well. Dr. Speckard, welcome to this conversation today. Indeed, a privilege to be speaking to you. All right, so let me first invite Dr. Gupta to share an opening remark and give us a general overview of how the face of terrorism is changing and how counterterrorism is adapting and needs to adapt, especially in countries like India. What are the new challenges, and if there's anything else that we need to know about these issues? So over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chaturvedi, and I want to thank Usana's Foundation for inviting me to this wonderful conference. Been a learning experience since the morning that I've been listening to some top-rated experts. So I really don't know how much I can add by way of any new information, because these are experts and they know the subject so well. But let me try and just frame my remarks in the format that you have just outlined. So I had just taken a few notes, and where have they disappeared? Let me just check. Oh God. Okay, I seem to have lost. Where is this? Just one moment, please.
Sure, not a problem. Not a problem.
Just give me a second. I'm just trying to understand. Yeah, here they are. Okay, can you hear me?
We can hear you fine. Yes.
See, I think the challenges to counterterrorism, we must understand in the context of the several 4 or 5 major trends that I see. One is that the geopolitical landscape is changing very rapidly. The return of great power rivalries is not quite obvious. And there is a general weakening of multilateralism, which will also have impact on the weakening of international cooperation. The second trend is that there is a dispersal and spread of terrorism to a large part of the globe. The third is, now that the Taliban have returned after 20 years of so-called global war on terrorism, what does it indicate? Do we see, are we going to see an uptick in terrorism, international terrorism? Because there are still a number of very potent global terrorist groups which are still operating in Afghanistan, including the ISIS and Al-Qaeda. And many other groups like the Lashkar-e-Taiba, Jaish-e-Mohammed, etc. And I think a very big question that I have in my mind is, will the US remain focused on the strong, intensive counter-terrorism campaign that it had launched as a part of the global war on terrorism, or is its attention going to be focused elsewhere? So these are, I think, some of the questions I have, the general remarks. Then many speakers earlier have spoken about a very major threat that is arising, which is becoming, in fact, stronger by the day, and that is that of radicalization. And I don't want to dwell much on this because this is well understood in this conference. Then there is this massive challenge of technology, which has been there with us. But the social media challenge is very big and huge. It has many dimensions, and maybe we could discuss that in our Q&A. Cyber terrorism has been mentioned. And also now we can talk about perhaps cryptocurrencies, which are also becoming a source of funding for many of the terrorist activities. Another, I think, relatively less explored area, but certainly it's been flagged quite often. But the details, I think, are missing. And this is the nexus between terrorism and organized crime. The organized crime syndicates and their output, if somebody makes an estimate, goes into tens of trillions of dollars. It's a very big thing, and terrorists share this linkages with them, and it's a challenge before the counter-terrorism community to deal with this terrorism and organized crime linkages. A lot has been spoken about international cooperation, the UN efforts and bilateral efforts and so on. But if you look at, I think there are still some lots of weaknesses, in fact, in international cooperation even today, and these are likely to increase with the changing international landscape and weakening of multilateralism. One of the weaknesses, for instance, is that there is no UN convention on international terrorism, which India has talked about for a long time, but there's simply no progress. I mean, we have been talking about it since the mid-90s, in fact. Yeah. And this is because one country's terrorist is other country's freedom fighter, and there are multiple standards on or multiple definitions. There are good terrorists and bad terrorists and so on. So there is no consensus on who is a terrorist. Then we may also, I think, conclude by the literature and so on, reading the literature, that lot of international cooperation is focused on tactical issues, and that's nothing wrong in it, but not on really the strategic aspects. So we don't really come to a consensus on the strategic aspects of terrorism. One may even ask, now that we have the Taliban have returned and ISIS is strong still, and Al-Qaeda, which the US wanted to defeat, are still there. How effective has been the counterterrorism efforts internationally over the last few years? I think an honest assessment is needed. Then I think there is a very important aspect of counterterrorism, and that is that there is insufficient attention to state-sponsored terrorism. And I think Pakistan has been mentioned quite often. So there is this differing perceptions amongst different countries about terrorism and its scope, etc. And we know, just one small example, how China blocked the listing of Masood Azhar as the global terrorist. And that really was a setback to the counterterrorism efforts, at least in some parts, particularly in India. Now we are seeing some new developments, new factors, which we have to take note of. Vulnerabilities, socio-economic, political vulnerabilities created by the COVID crisis. I think that's one factor that we have to take into account. And we also see that apart from the Salafi and Jihadi terrorism, there are also other factors like racism, xenophobia, environmentalism, animal rights, though at a small scale, but this could also be a factor going forward. As far as India is concerned, I think our counter-terrorism challenges, Kashmir has been talked about. So it's been really state-sponsored terrorism is the main issue for us. And this has been with us for a very long time. And I would say even since 1947, when the Pakistanis sponsored tribal invasions of Kashmir, and these raiders, at that time they were called, they indulged in lootings, arson, rape, and so on. And in today's language, they would be called terrorists. India also faces this very changed regional situation, particularly with the return of the Taliban, and this would result in both terrorism and radicalization, and both feeding on each other. And we are already seeing some samples of it. For instance, we saw a massive catch of heroin at one of the Indian ports some months ago. And this consignment originated from the Taliban-ruled Afghanistan, went to Iran, and then came to India. And that is one example. Yes, we have some new opportunities. I think India-Israel, India-US cooperation, etc., was mentioned, but they have been going on. But whether we'll see new opportunities in the new Quad or in the Quad, or India is also cooperating in the anti-terrorism center in Tashkent under the Shanghai Cooperation Organization aegis. That is remains to be seen. Our Prime Minister has been emphasizing the terrorist threat to the world international security at every single multilateral fora, and also been emphasizing the need for a UN convention on combating international terrorism. So I think these are some of the areas which India would be concerned with. And of course, at the same time, we'll also need to enhance our capabilities, both within and also with through international cooperation. So I'll stop here and take questions.
So thank you so much, Dr. Gupta. And before I invite Dr. Warren to share his opening remarks, let me just ask a very quick follow-up question to you, Dr. Gupta. When you say that at the level of international cooperation, there's been a lot of tactical discussions, but not so much discussions around strategy, or the whole approach is more tactical than strategic. For the benefit of our audience, could you just elaborate on that?
No, for instance, why is it that we do not have a UN convention on international terrorism? Just one question.
Right.
What is our, why is it that we have multiple approaches to defining who is terrorism? Why do we have this good terrorist and bad terrorist kind of a thing? So, I mean, these are some of the
Absolutely. Well, I have a number of questions for you, but I'll bring them later on. But for now, let me invite Dr. Warren. Dr. Warren, I've been recently reading a lot of your work on cybersecurity and cyber financing, etc., etc. And I am just curious to know as to what your sense is regarding certain emerging threats, emerging technologies, etc., that are problems from a counter-terrorism perspective. I also saw that you've recently written about how some of these initiatives have been targeted towards disrupting the supply of COVID vaccines, etc., etc. But generally, if you could give us an overview about what are the challenges that we are facing, and what are the challenges we are likely to face from a cyber technology perspective.
Excellent, thank you. As I said, it's a great honor to be here. I've been looking at how terrorist organizations use technology and online technology since the early 2000s. And really, there's 5 ways that they use the technology, and I'll talk about that, and then talk about some of the future issues and problems. So really, in terms of how terrorist groups use technology, whether that's the internet, social media, mobile technology, the primary reason way that they use it simply is for communication. It's a way for them to be able to control and coordinate activity. What they're also able to do is effectively use online technology from a propaganda perspective, and the impact that that has is, as was mentioned before, it allows radicalization of individuals on the other side of the world to join a political cause. It allows recruitments of members, and we've seen that where social media is being used to recruit members, foreign fighters from the Western world for ISIS in their caliphate in Iraq and Syria, which is a problem that the West is having to deal with. And also fundraising. The fundraising one is an interesting one because in the 2000s it was really around credit card payments, which governments very much realized was a problem, that they could then control it. The problem you now have is in terms of cryptocurrency and where anonymous payments occur, it's much harder for governments to track those financial payments. We also see the development of the darknet, and what the darknet is really a subversion of the internet that's disconnected from the main internet. It really is a closed internet. And what that allows for is the exchange of criminal activities, whether that's drugs, whether it's hacked data, pornographic images, whatever. But it also allows physical services to be offered through that platform as well, whether that's illegal goods that are sold, drugs, etc. Whether it's hacking for sale. So it means that terrorist groups can actually, if they don't have the hacking capability within their own organization, can actually go to the darknet and hire that expertise on their behalf. What we're now seeing in terms of sort of the future trends is really how the radicalization, particularly via social media, is in the West has led to an increase in lone wolf attacks. So you see individuals who have no physical connection with a terrorist organization undertake acts of terror in the West in the name of that terrorist group. And the internet and social media is the only way that they become radicalized. Part of the problem we have is when you look at social media in terms of Facebook, that there's 2.6 billion active Facebook users, is quite simply as a system, it's so large it cannot be managed effectively in real time by Facebook. So it means that many of these groups use it in different forms and aren't sort of picked up, or where they are, they can set up another profile or another sort of chat group very easily before it's sort of picked up again. What we're also seeing in the West is the problem around mobile communications and encrypted point-to-point communications. We're seeing, terrorist groups using, these encrypted messaging apps, or such as Telegram, for instance, to share information, to radicalize their supporter base. Again, it's getting harder and harder for government with their intelligence entities to be able to gain access to that data because it's encrypted, and if they are able to de-encrypt it, because the amount of time it takes to do that, the importance of that intelligence is lost. What we haven't seen, and again, it's a term that's often use is cyber terrorism, and really this concept of cyber terrorism was one that was developed in the early 2000s. So again, it was the idea to be able to cause terror via technology and via the internet. To date, we've not seen that. We've seen a bit of a confusion around the term hacktivism, where political hacking occurs in terms of websites being defaced, but that isn't cyber terrorism. What we've seen, the closest group we've seen in relation to cyber terrorism is a group called the Syrian Electronic Army, which operated in Syria on behalf of the Syrian government. And what they did was attack Western media organizations, hacked them to put forward their own political narrative on behalf of the Syrian government. What we haven't seen, and for me this will be the biggest trend into the future, is when these groups have the capability to actually attack what is known as critical infrastructure. So these are critical infrastructure that entire societies are dependent on, in terms of our water system, power, banking system. All of these systems are now being more readily controlled by the internet, by a technology-enabled system. And the worry that we're seeing is that if these terrorist groups start to attack a country's critical infrastructure, that they're able to have a massive impact upon a larger society. What we're seeing is state threat actors like China, being able to attack critical infrastructure around the world, and that's been readily documented. What we haven't seen, which will be the challenge in the future, is cyber terrorist groups being able to do that. We've started to see the emerge of something called cyber militias, which is where hacking groups are brought together through a national identity. We've seen this in Russia in terms of the Estonian-Russia cyber conflict, where through through being patriotic, they were able to undertake cyber attacks on behalf of a country without necessarily the support and direction of that country. So I think in the future that there's going to be a whole range of different trends that we're going to see. The biggest problem I see is the fact that governments, because of the technology, particularly around encryption, are going to find it harder and harder to break into these groups to be able to intercept information to determine what's actually happening with those organizations.
Absolutely, and I think those are great challenges that the governments have, because on one hand there's this whole concern for privacy for the citizens, etc., which has spurred this whole call of more encryption and more private access to these things. And on the other hand, there are these issues for which government needs access to some communication like that. And so just a question regarding some of the things that you were talking about. Do you, for example, worry about things such as technology? Like, I know a lot of people are talking about artificial intelligence these days, but then I was talking to somebody at the Munich Security Conference, and they also said that something that they worry about a lot is, let's say, quantum computing getting into the wrong hands at this point of time. And do you see that that's probably going to be something that we could see within the next decade? And preemptively, just and I know it's quite premature to ask that, but preemptively, what could the governments do to protect their critical info at this point?
Well, certainly quantum computer poses some interesting challenges, because again, what you're talking about is a massive increase in the processes of transactions, which in a normal commercial context or scientific context wouldn't be a problem. It'd be a good thing. The problem is if an adversary uses it to undertake, let's say, a denial of service attack, where organizations are bombarded with data. The idea is you bring down the systems based on the volume of data. What you'll see is an increase in the volume of attack vectors in terms of the sheer amount of data being aimed towards particular key servers. The other big worry about quantum is around quantum computing. And we see the problem now with encryption on apps in terms of quantum computing. The mathematical keys and the speed in which data would be encrypted and de-encrypted, it would be next to impossible for governments to be able to intercept and de-encrypt that data. So I think that there's a number of sort of worries about how terrorist groups could use these technologies in the future. I think the biggest concern is the communication aspects, is that many governments simply will be going dark because they won't have the ability to intercept those communications in a time appropriate period.
No, certainly, those are great challenges. Let me also bring in Abhinav into this discussion. So, Abhinav, if you're here, just want to hear your thoughts about some of these issues about counterterrorism. I know that you've spent a lot of time, writing about this issue, spent a lot of time on the ground studying this issue. I want to understand specifically, and I would also come to Dr. Gupta with a very similar question about radicalization, especially in the context of India, but also other parts of the world. That what are some of the processes, the emerging processes of radicalization that we are seeing right now, and what should be the sort of appropriate response from government actors to prevent terrorist recruitment and things like that. I remember Dr. Gupta saying in one of the interviews that we need a whole of society approach, and I'd come to Dr. Gupta to discuss how that whole of society approach would look like. But over to you, Abhinav.
Thank you very much, Arpit. You raised a very, very crucial point. So I feel that on the war against terror, global war against terror over the last 20 years, I guess the focus was a little narrow. When it was about terror financing, we mostly focused on the formal channels of money movement like banking system and all. When it came to the real-time terrorists, we mostly focused on the kinetic operations. But there was a major part on which I guess the counterterrorism community missed out, and that was the role of Islamist organization and radicalization. By Islamist organization, I mean the organizations which are overtly not indulging in any violence, and in fact, they claim to be indulging in developmental activities, educational activities, or some kind of religious groups doing propaganda, missionary work. But such groups, not just in India, not only in Kashmir, in Pakistan, I mean, almost everywhere, they have played a major role in radicalizing the overall society and creating a very, very fertile ground, facilitating the recruitment and injecting hatred in the minds of the people.
Yeah.
For instance, I can tell you, in France, 80% of the terrorist cadres, they had this Tablighi Jamaat background. In Kashmir, Kashmir is one of the finest example where Pakistan has created in a very scientific manner, in a very systematic manner, and an overall system of infrastructure of radicalization over the last 30 years. Pakistan knew it goddamn well that Kashmir was a liberal society, a Sufi believing society, so there was hardly any scope for extremist ideology or a terrorist movement in Kashmir. And for that, they needed to create an overall milieu, a socio-political milieu where you have Islamist tendencies, some kind of an extremist attitude becomes a dominant narrative. And for that, they entrusted the task to Jamaat-e-Islami. Now, Jamaat-e-Islami functioned as a perfectly legal entity, building schools, colleges, working all the missionary, doing all the missionary work in the villages, arranging for the marriages of the people, arranging for their education, for the relief work. but the curriculum which they were imparting, it was a poisonous curriculum. It was based on Maulana Maududi's ideology and the idea of political Islam. Slowly and slowly over the last 30 years, they injected their people. They filled, I mean, they could penetrate the state systems, including the police, the intelligence, civil society, civil services, academia, everywhere. So in the process, the entire system, I would say the mainstream institutions of the state, including the politics, the administration, all of them, willingly or unwillingly, became some kind of an accomplice or rather, and that's where Modi government to identify the problem, and this was the reason what is you can see that now it has made a major dent in the terrorist infrastructure in Kashmir, be it terror financing, be it radicalization infrastructure. As you know that after the Pulwama attack, the government banned Jamaat-e-Islami. They just this NIA started a crackdown on terror financing, which brought major lockdowns. It brought down translated terror incidents. So it helped in a major way. So radicalization per se, I would say, all these charities, even in the for now, I'll go to the US. In US, you have various organizations like Kashmir Canadian Council, Kashmir American Council, ICNA, Islamic Council of North America. They are absolutely legal entities working in a perfectly, formal setup, and you will find their conclaves, conferences attended by great civil rights activists, including some of our interlocutors like Mr. Radha Kumar and even some big great names, Mr. Gautam Navlakha. They are all civil rights, human rights activists, and claiming to be like all liberal thinkers. But I don't know whether they knew about the real intentions of these Islamist organizations or not. That's actually under doubt. But some of these organizations have very intricate ties with Hamas, with Muslim Brotherhood, with other Palestinian terrorist organizations, and with Hizbul Mujahideen, with Lashkar-e-Taiba. Mr. Fay was arrested by the US government, the federal agencies, all lobbies. So these organizations had become so powerful that they were getting all the aid from the USAID, the State Department, for the development work. And they could play such a strong role that they could mobilize and work with the Congress members in the US, the lawmakers. And if you see their record, they were transferring funds to POK in the name of relief work, and those funds were going to Lashkar-e-Taiba. Those funds were going to Khidmat Foundation. So these organizations, because of our neglect, they have made a massive penetration, not only in the West, but in India also in various parts. And we can see that now, I mean, recently, as we came across the cases in Kerala, which being the most literate state, very advanced in terms of all other indicators, GDP, provided the highest number of recruits to ISIS from India. It has an array of Islamist and radical organizations. So this is my take on that, and I think this is going to be a big challenge in the future because until recently we were talking about the state sponsors to terrorism, which is absolutely great. But once you unleash these radicalizing Islamist organizations, then this whole business of terrorism gets into an autopilot mode, because they facilitate extremism, they facilitate all this nasty propaganda, then which in turn facilitates recruitment, and it just goes on and on. So I think that in the future, the counterterrorism community needs to think very seriously to bring all these radical Islamist organizations in the ambit of very serious anti-terrorism laws, deal with them in the most, I would say, ruthless and serious manner, just to counter them. This is my take, and I have some other things to share, which I can
absolutely,
share
and I'd love to discuss them with you. For example, you talked about how different regions get radicalized, and I've talked to other experts who say that there's this whole process that almost you can outline that. First, they'll start influencing they'll start collecting information on the influential families in that location. Then a lot of them would also try to marry into those families. And then, there's a lot of propaganda. And then through informal institutions, there's just a lot of ideological brainwashing that takes place before, any sort of overt operations or before any sort of an overt expression of radicalization is identified by any sort of a government agency. So a lot of time, I think, government agencies are not in lockstep with these, trends just gaining a foothold in some of these areas. But Abhinav, I'll come back to you. Let me go back to Dr. Gupta, and Dr. Gupta, if we can.
Just one more thing.
Sure, Abhinav, go ahead.
Just one more. Yeah. So in this regard, I would really like to thank Vivekananda International Foundation and Dr. Gupta sir also, because I guess this is an organization which took lead in researching on radicalization. I did my first project on radicalization at Vivekananda International Foundation and wrote a book on this. I would say some kind of very distinct work on radicalization, which is being read by people these days. And I came out with the concept of National Radicalization Index in that book, which is basically a set of 15 to 20 indicators. And based on that, we developed the concept of National Radicalization Index, which can be at the district level, level, county level, national level, and it can be developed into a statistical tool. So again, once again, my thanks to Gupta sir and Vivekananda Foundation. Over to Dr. Gupta. Yes.
Thank you for that question. See, as I think Abhinav has answered that question quite well in his last remarks. The radicalization, you see, so far we have been following in counterterrorism, we have been following essentially a law enforcement approach. But that has changed. Today, radicalization has come as a major driver for terrorism. And radicalization is in minds. And of course, it is assisted by technology and social media and etc., which Mr. Warren talked about. So, but if you break it down to the essentials, essentially, it is about narratives. It is about the contest between narratives. ISIS, etc., which now has no territory, but it is so powerful because they have an ideological thing, and they go back to the origins of Islam, etc. And they try to build a narrative which seems credible to the impressionable minds.
Absolutely.
So similarly, the governments or the society, I think, has to build a credible narrative to counter that. Problem is, a lot of what the terrorists say goes unchallenged. You have to have a very credible narrative, which unfortunately doesn't happen and which doesn't get the support. It's not that you do not know how to counter that, but building a narrative and spreading it and getting it accepted is a totally different ballgame. And that's why different elements of the society, different stakeholders come into play. So that is what I mean by whole of society approach. So it will require awareness, dealing with counter radicalization, a lot of counter radicalization efforts, and which is now a fairly widespread and I mean very well researched field now. A lot of countries, including Saudi Arabia and many others, have launched those efforts, and I think that is something that we can learn from. Involving the civil society is also very important, but civil society is a double-edged sword, as was mentioned by. But nevertheless, it is indispensable to your success in counter radicalization and taking all the steps which I think were mentioned by Mr. Warren in terms of technology, how to use technology. And I want to say here, I think just a little digression. You see, the terrorists are not looking necessarily for the most modern technologies.
Of course.
So, quantum computing, etc., if there is an application which is available, in quantum computing application which is readily available, they will use it. But they are not going to spend any time researching quantum computing and then see what we can do about it. So I think it is the how easily those technologies are available. And let's not forget that most of terrorism is done by easily available relatively low-cost technologies, which may have been high technologies at one point of time, but now they're
Certainly.
quite commonplace.
Like Telegram and stuff like that.
Telegram or even social media was it's now a commonplace technology. 10, 15 years ago, it was not.
Or gaming chat
So,
boxes, etc.
chat boxes, etc. We have also any approach, you see, in building credible narratives and also activities, they have to have, in democracies particularly, they have to be within the framework of rule of law. Because otherwise, many of these counterterrorism approaches can lead to more radicalization also.
Absolutely.
You overdo it and then you have a huge problem. So I think that's what I meant by open society.
Absolutely, absolutely. So let me just quickly, come with a counter question to Abhinav on this, because you've mentioned something with that regard, and after that, I'll come to Dr. Warren. So Abhinav, one thing that I picked up from Dr. Gupta's statement right now is that when you read about radicalization that is taking place in ISIS, and especially if you read about people who have defected from the ISIS and they give their interviews, etc. So even now, when they are disillusioned by the ISIS, they still say that their 1 week or 3 week program where they talk about ideology, religion, etc. They still value that bit quite a lot. So even after they've been disillusioned by ISIS, they say that that particular thing taught me a lot about Islam. They taught me how to pray properly. They taught me how to conduct certain observances properly. So which also means that as human beings or as a group of people, there's a high need for some sort of religion. And perhaps that's the vacuum that very insidiously some of these terrorist organizations fill in a very seemingly non-dangerous entry point, which again turns into this whole complex of radicalization later on. So that's true in terms of ISIS, but do you also see that happening, for example, in Kashmir?
Yeah. Thank you very much. This is again a very interesting issue. So let me tell you, I mean, all these recruits who are joining ISIS, I mean, they are not the people with a great religious depth or even with great religious inclination.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. If you read Olivier Ray, is a very famous French counterterrorism expert. His thesis, he found that most of these ISIS people they were from the second generation Muslim families who came from North Africa, Algeria, and they could not integrate well with the European society. They were facing issues with employment. They had become like totally deviant from their religious practices earlier. They were into drinking. They were into
Yeah.
multiple sexual relationships. They were into homosexuality, and most of them were into petty crimes. They had lost their jobs. So they were feeling a big sense of loss in their lives, and they were lacking education. So it was an identity crisis. They were looking for an anchorage, and such vulnerable and impressionable minds were basically searched by ISIS recruiters in a very strategic manner, and they fell prey to that. Okay? So they're not the people with great religious knowledge. And even in Kashmir, I can tell you, there are boys who you'll find a big contrast. You'll find youngsters who are having girlfriends, who are having a great life in college. They're into drugs. Even girls, they're into drugs. Okay? And then they just because they are having a major loss of identity because they don't have jobs. They are not treated. Sometimes their families just are very sarcastic with them that well, you're not doing anything, this that. The governance is pathetic. So that's again, and sometimes they're beaten, maybe on occasions by security forces. Those little petty revenge feelings are there. And then, in certain those emotional moments, they just join the militancy, or due to some peer pressure, they join the militancy. But they're not the people with great religious insights. If you argue with one of them, even the militants who have been caught alive, militants belonging to hardcore Jaish and groups like Jaish and Lashkar who have been arrested, when they were interrogated by officers from Jammu and Kashmir police, who had some really great insights on religious scriptures, When they were interrogated, they said, they had nothing to answer for. Just, for instance, I'll just give one example. I was talking to one very senior Ahle Hadith uh, preacher in Kashmir, a Maulvi, Wahhabi Salafi Maulvi, and I asked him, well, tell me, do you think that this Kashmir fight, is it a jihad? He just took me inside his house and asked me to keep quiet for a while. And then he said that, well, I hope you're not recording anything. I said, I'm not. Okay. Then he said that, well, I can tell you that this is not jihad, because jihad is for the divine purpose. Jihad is to further the cause of Allah. And this whole Kashmir business is about power. It's a fight for land, for the territory. It can never be jihad. But once, because of certain vested political interest, this whole thing becomes the mainstream narrative, this jihad business connected with the territory, power, land. So one needs, if you have some major religious scholars, if they can dare to challenge this, if they come out, and I think they should come out, it's their duty, because these terror groups are doing the biggest disservice to the cause of religion itself.
Absolutely.
They're completely diminishing, destroying the whole young generation, especially among the Muslim community. So the true scholars should come out and they should really define what jihad means, what Quran says. And I'm sure if there is an independent, honest and fearless debate, these terror groups or Islamist organizations will stand no chance.
Absolutely.
And once again, I agree with Dr. Gupta that this needs a whole of society approach and a measure approach which is within the framework of law and order, within the framework of law. Yes.
Absolutely. Thank you, Abhinav. And building on that, let me come to Dr. Warren. I have a question for you, and then we have one question from the audience as well. So, Dr. Warren, my question again is related to something that Dr. Gupta just said. If you'd like to respond to that indeed, a lot of these terrorist organizations, they rely on low tech, or shallow technology, and while they do that, it is still difficult for if you even frame it in terms of the whole of society approach, it is still difficult for government centers, research centers to manage some of these terrorist activities through technology, or intercept some of these communications through technology, even if it is very basic low tech, such as Telegram or gaming chat centers, etc., etc. So what do you think is really needed in the direction of striking the right kind of agreements with some of these tech providers, or just developing greater capabilities to look at how these communications are taking place from a cyber security perspective? What are some of the strategies beyond the ones that we typically hear, that okay, somehow just more monitoring.
I think we face a major issue, and that's what is called the balkanization of the internet, and that's, instead of the global internet being one global network that everyone's part of, there's going to be a number of separate networks. There's going to be the internet in China, the internet in Russia, the internet in Saudi Arabia, the Western internet, and I think the problem you have is it's going to be difficult to have any global control or monitoring because the technology and the management of that technology is going to be more and more linked to sort of geopolitical blocks.
Right.
One of the things that we saw in the Cold War, for instance, was the Warsaw Pact and other communist governments would give resources to terrorist groups around the world, and that was in physical arms, explosives, what happens. So that happened historically. But what you could see is a situation where in the future is that governments of a particular persuasion may not share arms with terrorist groups. They may share technology or highly advanced technology for those terrorist groups to use. So I think certainly that you are going to see technology dissemination, and you will see terrorist organizations have access to advanced cyber technology or advanced technology resources. Not that they've sort of got that through their own capabilities, but they've
Yeah.
been gifted that through other governments who would see an advantage in those groups having access to those technologies.
So sooner or later, we are going to see more of that, terrorists having access to even advanced technology and not just the current low tech that they have.
It's certainly, I think that's something that will happen in the future, because we've seen, especially now, the development of hybrid warfare, is seeing refugees being used as weapons on borders between countries. You can see sort of technology and the application and transfer of technology being used in that same way from a hybrid warfare perspective of trying to disrupt societies or try to disrupt sort of existing norms.
And just very quickly before I come to Mr. Anurag Sharma's question over here, a lot of times in the territories which are occupied by these terrorist organizations and within their own cadres, there's a high degree of restriction on the technology that people can use, which means that some of the terrorist leaders are able to use all of the technology available in the world, but then the areas that they've occupied, they deny that sort of a technology usage to those people. Do you worry at some point of time that increasingly more and more governments in the whole effort of fighting some of these terrorists would begin to impose stricter measures of technology control on their own population?
Again, we've certainly seen that around the world. We've seen it in China. We've seen it in Mumbai recently. That information is taken away from citizens as a way of controlling them. So certainly that is a technique that governments do use around the world. But also we have to acknowledge that terrorist groups are very adaptive to use technology. For instance, in terms of ISIS, use of drones, in terms of using drones to deliver bomb payload explosives in a terrorist approach, and what they were using were domestic drones that people can buy in the shops and turn them into weapons. So again, right. I think we also have to acknowledge that terrorist groups will look at technology and see uses of those technologies in ways that we would not necessarily consider ourselves.
Absolutely. So thank you so much. Just now the question from Mr. Anurag Sharma, and I'm going to take audience questions now for the next 15 minutes. So Mr. Sharma is asking that in 2015, Islamic State established United Cyber Caliphate, or IS hacking division. And since then, the UCC carried out 8 cyber-enabled attacks, including hijacking the host service of Australia's Hobart International Airport in April 2015. IS's cyber division is decentralized and operational to the date. And as cyber attack strategy requires cyber infrastructure on the ground, how much possibility do you see of a state-sponsored cyber infrastructure to the IS's cyber division?
I'm certainly very, very aware of the Hobart example. And again, this comes back to my point of difference between hacktivism and cyber terrorism, because what happened was a hacking group hacked the Hobart Airport website for a period of time, put in pro sort of ISIS message, but what they then did was try to explain that they sort of took over the entire airport and had control of everything, when the reality was that they gained access to a website for the airport. And I think that this is also one of the issues we have to be aware of, is that terrorist organizations overstate their capabilities in order to become a greater threat, and certainly the situation is that they don't have those capabilities at the moment. That they state that they do, and they use these examples, but in many cases they're examples of just hacking websites rather than anything more sophisticated.
No, absolutely. And I think, one thing that people and the government needs to keep in mind, as you rightly said, that a lot of terrorist groups, they overstate their capabilities, and a lot of times they might just seem a lot more threatening than, they actually would be. And that kind of adds to, the whole industry of terror, of course. Well, let me come to another question, and this is from Mr. Pranay Das. And Pranay is asking that there are many organizations which have been banned by the government. However, they again come back with different names, especially in the guise of civil society and different agenda of doing the same old thing. How can government counter such things? So I don't know if Dr. Gupta or Abhinav, any one of you could take this question. Dr. Gupta or Abhinav, are you? Yeah, I am just going to read the question again for your convenience, sir. It says that there are many organizations which have been banned by the government right now, but they come back again with different names, especially in the guise of civil society, with different stated agendas, but eventually they're doing the same thing. How can some of these actions be countered by the government?
This is essentially through good vigilance. I think that is the only way. And I think India has a lot of experience of this, when the terrorist groups have mutated and gotten, taken different identities, etc. But again, we should look at the not the surface, but
Yes.
what is below it. And the below it is, we know it is most of them are sponsored from across the border. So our problem is, in India's case, it is cross-border terrorism which is the main problem, and it is the state-sponsored terrorism that is the main problem. And there is insufficient attention in the international community to state-sponsored terrorism, or if it is, then it is selective, only a selective focus on that. That's what I was trying to say. The international cooperation is not, focusing on strategic issues, which is that of the state-sponsored terrorism. So in this particular case, yes, I think constant vigil is probably the best. And once you have a whole of society approach, when the whole society is alerted to this, then it is easier, because ultimately it is monitoring, intelligence, information sharing, going after them. That is the way to deal with it.
Sure. And Dr. Gupta, there's a related question over here, and it might sound like, and as Ms. Bhargava said, it might sound like a politically incorrect or a naive question, but I think it is nevertheless a question that a lot of people, citizens have in their mind. And, as civil society organizations, I think we find a lot of value in getting answers to some of these questions. And she's asking that, if a lot of this terrorism is state sponsored, then is the solution the disintegration of Pakistan, or eventual integration of or inclusion of POK-COK into India, or the integration of Fatah and surroundings into Afghanistan? Do you think eventually those are the big steps that will have to be taken? Again, it might sound like too politically incorrect or naive a question, but I think nevertheless useful for the general
I think it's good to ask these questions, and
Yeah.
but also we must understand what is the nature of Pakistan. You can take any number of steps. We have taken number of steps. India has fought 4 wars with Pakistan. India has had a dialogue with Pakistan. So many things we have done. But the problem is that it is the DNA of Pakistan. it is ingrained in Pakistan's birth that there was this two-nation theory, etc.,
Yeah.
and which it tends to separate itself from India. And it sees India as an existential threat. India does not see Pakistan as an existential
Existential
threat.
threat. Yeah.
For us, Pakistan, uh, the partition did create a lot of problems, but India has accepted it. India has accepted that, and as a member, but Pakistan should behave like a responsible member of the international community. Once Pakistan behaves like an a responsible member of international community, following the international norms of behavior, of good neighborliness, etc., it is easier to live with Pakistan. But yes, I think
they
in
should
terms
do
of
it,
whether,
but we all know that they will not, because that's in a way their reason of existence.
yes, but now fragmentation of Pakistan has already happened.
Yeah.
We have seen that Bangladesh came off it. So you have now what about 50 years of experience to see what that has meant, and it has had a mixed result. To some
Yeah.
extent, Pakistan has been weakened, but at the same time, Pakistan has also become far more belligerent
Yeah.
because it has sponsored the terrorism, and it has used terrorism as an instrument of its policy. Now, that is, but yes, to the extent that it is, you see, Pakistan faces its internal problems also. So whether Pakistan disintegrates or no, we do not know. But the way Pakistan is going, it is facing many problems which are sui generis, which are unique to itself, and we'll have to live with it. One cannot say whether a weakened, fragmented Pakistan will become suddenly peace will arise. It may happen. I do not know, but it can also happen that more fragmentation that you have, more problems it would create. So it will be difficult to pronounce a judgment on that. But that is not, I think, the way for us to think. What we have to do is, whichever way, we will have to deal with the Pakistan challenge. Whether Pakistan is integrated or Pakistan is disintegrated, the challenge for us is going to remain. And this challenge is going to become bigger and bigger for us.
No, certainly. Thank you. And I also see our good old friend and mentor, Mr. Ambassador Anil Trigunayat over here. Hello, Ambassador. How are you? So good to see you. Okay, so I'm going to invite... yeah. Abhinav, I think Mr. Pranay Das also wanted your views on this. So, Abhinav, if you're in the room and if you could comment on this issue. Yeah.
First, I'll comment on that. The terror groups mutating. As far as Kashmir is concerned, I mean, I'm not worried at all. We don't need to worry because we have one of the finest intelligence apparatus in Kashmir, with a very strong penetration. So, I mean, whatever they do, they can change 100 names, but they won't be successful. Okay, and you can see with the number of encounters taking place every day, they're all based on a very nice combination of human and tech int. So Pakistan stands no chance. I'm more worried about the Islamist charities and these small petty religious groups existing in the other parts of India, maybe in Rajasthan, MP, Maharashtra, in the peninsular India. So they have this tendency to keep changing names and register under different names. Like even with their original names, they're not under the scanner of our security agencies. Recently, I investigated the data for a Qatari aid agency. So I came across a list of 1,200 transactions, and they were transferring money to various Islamist groups in Kerala. And there were some groups in the remote villages of UP, like in Western UP, Eastern UP. Me and my colleague Akshay also assisted me in that research project, in that investigation. And we found that in the original list, all the names were different. And while we started some open source research on them, their names had totally changed. So that's a bigger problem. In fact, if we had time, we could have asked Akshay to talk a little more about it. Okay, and maybe we can ask Akshay to just devote a minute, okay, after I finish. Okay,
sure.
And coming to the Pakistan's disintegration part, well, the way Pakistan is heading, it seems that I mean, the state institutions are, I mean, it's on a very logical and a very rapid pathway to, I would say, fragmentation or complete dysfunctionality of the state institutions. They have nurtured terror groups for decades. Now, especially this strong Deobandi extremist infrastructure with that whole system in Madrasa Haqqaniya, in areas around Karachi, with all those different groups like Lashkar-e-Jhangvi and multiple groups. Okay, it seems that such radical entities have made a huge headway. They have made a huge penetration in the state institutions, and even the Barelvis, for that matter, in Pakistan, they have become a very menacing, disturbing force. And now, with the rise of these radical groups, it seems unlikely that democracy will have any chance in Pakistan, because such groups can control only with the army. And in the case of Pak army, we see more and more penetration of these radical groups. So I mean, I just leave it open to interpretation. But if you ask me to conclude in a logical manner, there are enough indicators that Pakistan is headed for a very, very grim future. And as Dr. Gupta rightly said, whether it's integrated or disintegrated, there will be mounting challenges for India, and we'll have to deal with them.
Absolutely.
And may I invite Akshay just to devote a minute on that Qatari aid investigation? Just a minute, Akshay.
Go ahead, Akshay.
Thank you so much, Abhinav sir. Am I audible, Arpit? Can you hear me?
Yes, you are.
As the question said, the biggest challenge which we faced in our initial investigation was the fact that these organizations were very hard to trace in the public domain. So when we got that list of 12 organizations, Islamist organizations, there was no public trace, no social media trace of them. So that was the initial challenge. So when we contacted our ground sources and we dwelled a little more into the in the open source internet, then we realized that these organizations are working with different names, and they have been changing their names, their identity, their base area of operations regularly. And the biggest concern was that most of these organizations adhere to some radical form of Islamic ideology. So in Kerala, although we couldn't find a direct connection, but these funding channels to these organizations from Qatar-based charities, which are obviously very controversial, and some of them are even blacklisted by the UN. So these were during the time in which the most number of ISIS recruit happened from that state in Kerala. So that was a concerning thing. And also, as Abhinav sir mentioned, that these charities, they were working in very remote pockets of the country, like in Siddharth Nagar district of UP, which is not very developed socio-economically. And in that district also, in an area where there are so many local Islamic organizations which are working and which are known to have a very intolerant views towards other Islamic sects. So yes, this is a problem actually, where you have these organizations constantly mutate themselves, and it's very hard for the security agencies to actually keep a track of them.
Certainly. Thank you so much, Akshay. And with this, since we are running out of time, I would close the discussion for today. But thanks a lot, Dr. Gupta, Dr. Warren, Abhinav, and to all of our friends for asking such great questions and for having such an engaging discussion today. Thank you so much, and have a great rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Arpit. Thank you very much, Dr. Gupta and Professor Warren. So we really had an amazing discussion. So finally, we come to the end of this, I would say, not exactly the end, but end of the virtual part, as we have a valedictory ceremony tomorrow, but end of the virtual part of, I would say, 5-day event, and it has been absolutely great journey. So I'll request Ambassador Anil Trigunath, who's also the senior member of our advisory board and always a source of wisdom, guidance, and a great support to Usana's foundation and to this event in particular. Okay. Ambassador Trigunath, over to you for the vote of thanks and closing remarks.
Thank you, Abhinav and Arpit. It's good to see the two very dynamic people. And it was such a fascinating discussion. I ended the session and I have been following the proceedings of this webinar. I'm glad that Usana's foundation has really focused in a very comprehensive manner on the whole subject of terrorism, radicalization, how we can contain radicalization, how to fight terrorism. sometimes I used to always feel like when we were discussing about what to do about coronavirus, in one of the meetings, I said, even a man on the street knows what to do about it. So what are the people who have to actually do are really doing? Are they doing it together? Are they not cutting corners in dealing with the problem? That has been very clearly evident from nearly every presentation that has been made, whether it is about what happened in the last 20 years, the Americans who tried to launch a global war on terror did focus on terrorism after it has bled us white for 20 years before that, or even much more. They did not even acknowledge it. So we know about it. Then, whether it was they enabled a group whom they called terrorists and came after and made them far more stronger and created a new model for other terrorist groups to go ahead. And this is already evident in Syria and elsewhere. HSM and other groups have really changed their tactics. They think that now this is a new way of getting legitimized. So that is one. Secondly, we talk about ISIS, and President Trump, as I said, had taken great credit in March 2019, saying that the territory has been. Let us not forget, whether it is ISIS, whether it is Islamic terrorism, or any terrorism of any kind, xenophobia, it is the problem of the idea. You have to fight the idea, and then you can fight the network and the infrastructure. That is very clear, and we don't fight that. The reason is it's also very clearly evident in the international domain when we say that our Prime Minister Modi actually did say that the terrorism, what it is, has still not been defined. Forget about having an international mechanism where everybody is on board. We are not on board. So we find that those are the kind of problems. I think that what is to be done is also everybody knows what is to be done. But I think, as has been mentioned, as whole of society, whole of government approach within a global context is absolutely essential. Technology, you will always see that whether it is technology or whether it is breaking any rules, the people who are on the other side of the spectrum use it better, more in a negative way. So the ISIS is a great example of that, actually, for people to learn that how beautifully they, and there was one of the Indians, origin person out of UK, who was heading their ID cell for that matter. So this, how strongly they were able to use it at a low cost. Likewise, we have seen during the Taliban and Afghan government, that is the bigger threat of the region today, that Taliban used the social media, its public communication skills far better than the Afghan government. They were not able to send any narrative, whereas Taliban was able to do it so much faster. For the first time in India, we also saw that all the Taliban leaders were talking to nearly every media house in India. They were giving narrative speech, and people got carried away. That's quite possible. The victory of Taliban has obviously has a salutary impact on the morale of the various other terrorist groups or extremist groups within India and elsewhere. They think that they can defeat the strongest power, so we are more powerful. Now, these are the narratives that are going to carry forward. So what we are looking at is not a problem that's going anywhere. I do not even see today a resolve, international resolve to fight it. In fact, very often we see these statements coming out from every country. Then we have, whether it is a BRICS summit, whether it is the RIC, whether it is any international organization or meetings or bilaterals, you see, terrorism is always mentioned now. Mentioning is also a beginning, good beginning. But what do we do about it? So the bilaterally, it is possible. We heard about Qatar. The Wahhabi Salafi philosophies that were perpetrated by Saudi Arabia, by all the countries in the Middle East, actually, those who were there. I mean, the irony is that while Gaddafi and Saddam Hussein may have been the worst, but at the same time, they tried to keep these extremists out of their own countries. They were doing it elsewhere for different reasons, supporting them. But the cause is also equally important. And what kind of action are we taking? This is also another thing is that has really made a big growth of terrorism in the past 20, 30 years is essentially the regime change agenda and the unilateral international intervention. Nobody ever thought of what will be the after effect of this. And that is what has led to a much greater cohesion and syndicalization of the terror, in my view. And I think that Pakistan, which has gotten away by being awarded actually for that kind of a behavior, that it has, because they thought that it is an isolated incident between India and Pakistan. So let Pakistan continue to do and nurture all these terror groups. The whole world knows that they are the factory of terrorism. The deep state in Pakistan, Rawalpindi gang or whatever you call it, has been working overtime. Now somebody mentioned about the changes, the name. When we see the change in name of the terror groups, well, they do it. They do so basically. They just want to get out of the financial sanctions, nothing else. And with the connivance of the state, non-state actors are far, far more powerful today. You look at the free edge that Iran enjoys with. They are one is the Hamas, the other is Houthi, and the third is Hezbollah. They are big armies. You cannot fight them so easily. They are bigger than sometimes the state. They can be stabilized because they use asymmetric means. You or me, technology has created a major, major challenge for everyone now. So I think that we'll have to work with both Chaturvedism. We have to work with against the Khawarij, against the narrative. And I think that greater public discourse should be there. Everybody should be a stakeholder, and we should have interfaith dialogue. The communal discourse must go away unless you know. And of course, the most important thing I remember that once King Abdullah of Jordan told me, he said, look, if I employ somebody, I pay not more than 500 dinars. These so many unemployed people. But the ISIS is paying 1,000 dinars plus a promise in the afterlife. So, this is what happens. They are being funded. They are getting technology. They are getting everything. So much is easily accessed. Dark web is very much there. Everybody knows about it. So I think that today and this webinar has actually, in conference, has really brought the best of the minds in the field and excellent discussions. We have identified the problems. We have identified the solutions that are likely possible. We know the collaboration and that nobody who indulges in terrorism should be able to go scot. That is something that is the bottom line. And it is a problem that will only be resolved through an international, national, everybody has to be on board. In any society where there are social inequities, in any society where there is a persecution of one group or the other, does have the potential of people using extremist means, and whether through radicalization. See, radicalization is a state of mind that needs to be fought with a better idea, with a better communication network. And I believe that all governments are seized with it, but we are all trying to do in silos. There are many things, everybody on his own. So let's try to develop some kind of format from here in this conference. If we can give certain recommendations which have been extended and advanced by these finest minds who have participated today. And I know that we cannot just thank them enough for taking the time out, and they have been constantly working on it. So I would like to, without naming everyone, but I would like to say that a very big thank you. And we are really gratified by your presence. And as Dr. Gupta mentioned, that there is something called terrorism appropriate behavior, like the COVID appropriate behavior, that needs to be nurtured at every step of the way, from the poorest, from the lowest to the highest. And thank you, Abhinav, Akshay, and everybody, and Arpit, for really taking it forward and bringing it to this level. This is the first NO security dialogue, and I think it is going to be a continuation for good. So I want to thank everyone who has participated today, and we are grateful for your comments, your deliberations, your suggestions, and the way forward. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you very much, Ambassador Tirunai. In the end, I would like to thank all the participants who joined the event and made this mega dialogue a great success. My humble regards to all of you, and hope to see you in all our future events also. On 20th, we'll be releasing the poster soon. We'll have a dialogue on cyber threats in South Asia on the 20th of this month. We're doing it with an Israeli Institute for Cybrief. Speakers will be finalized very soon, and we'll be releasing the poster very soon. It'll be on our social media and on our website. Okay, so please do join in. And I also thank my entire team, Akshay, Preeti, Lavanya, Mehak, Mihir, and Vedika. Thank you so much for making this conference a big success. And special thanks to Nina Slama, who is our Israel-India Affairs Coordinator. She has been a great support in this entire conference. She was moderating one of our sessions today. Thank you so much. And thanks to our advisory board members that include C.D. Sahai sir, Madhav Nalpat sir, Gautam Sen sir, Kondapalli sir, and Ashok Sajanar sir. And all our partner organizations, knowledge partners, our sponsors, ICWA, Mahana Mewar Foundation, and Manipal Education Services Foundation. So all my big thanks to you. And IVA from Delhi. Thank you so much.